Welcome to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. This week, we're going to look at the question, is the origin of life, or is chemical evolution, or is abiogenesis part of the theory of evolution? We're going to take on that question and explore the relationship between the origin of life and the theory of evolution in just a second. But before I do that, just a few business items, if you allow me. First of all, for those of you that are watching the broadcast, either live or recorded versions of the broadcast, please take a moment and check in the comments section. Let me know who you are, where you're watching from. This is valuable information for us to have, but it's also a great way for me to know who you are. And I really do want to know who you are. And maybe you might even include some reasons why you think this broadcast is useful or ways in which the broadcast could be improved. Also, take a moment and react to the broadcast with the like button. This is really important for us because it helps us to increase the visibility of the broadcast in the Facebook feed. Also, I want to know what you think about the question, is the origin of life part of the theory of evolution? So if you've got your perspective that you want to be aired out, please add that perspective in the comments section, even if you disagree with my viewpoints, because I want to create environments on my public figure and personal Facebook pages, as well as on YouTube, where people can have civil conversations about very important issues relating to science and the Christian faith. So I want to hear from you. And then one last point of business. For those of you that are watching the broadcast, we've got some free stuff to give you, just as a way to say thank you for taking the time to see what we're doing here on Facebook Live. If you text if you text FUZZ, F-U-Z, to 31996, text FUZZ, F-U-Z, to 31996, it'll take you to a portal that will give you access to PDF copies of 2 chapters in a book, Origins of Life, that I co-authored with Hugh Ross, and we're talking about the origin of life question today. Also, you can gain access to a free video download of a talk that I gave on why I believe that God exists as a biochemist. And in this presentation, I talk about the role that biochemistry played in my conversion to Christianity. So text FUZZ to 31996 to gain access to a portal that will get you some free resources that will help you on your science faith journey. Also, if you don't want to text that to gain access to the portal, you can go to reasons.org/fuzz, reasons.org/FUZ to gain, again, access to these free science faith resources. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take on today's question. And this question is abiogenesis, is the origin of life, is chemical evolution part of the theory of evolution, was a topic that came up a few weeks ago when I was engaging a few people from a skeptical viewpoint on Facebook. In fact, this question came up just a few minutes ago before I started this Facebook Live broadcast in response to an article that I posted about scientific challenges to the theory of evolution. And what triggered this conversation is the claim that I made that the inability of the scientific community to explain the origin of life, or abiogenesis, or chemical evolution, undermines the grand claim of the evolutionary paradigm, namely that the origin, design, history, and diversity of life can be explained exclusively through mechanism. And this claim, along with the article that I posted, triggered a response on the part of a couple of people, again, who were skeptics, who argued that I was actually being disingenuous by linking the theory of evolution to the origin of life problem, with the idea that if we can't explain the origin of life, this casts aspersion to all of the theory of biological evolution. And so people objected to that maneuver on my part. Well, let me go ahead and respond to that claim about being disingenuous, because I was very careful in the post to refer to the challenge to the evolutionary paradigm, not the theory of evolution. And that may seem like a subtle and insignificant point, but it actually is a very critical point, because in my view, the evolutionary paradigm, and I actually defined what I meant by the paradigm, the view that the origin, design, history, and diversity of life could be explained by mechanism, I view the evolutionary paradigm as distinct from the theory of biological evolution. Because in my view, the evolutionary paradigm is akin to a worldview. It is this perspective, this deep-seated commitment to the idea that mechanism alone can account for biology. And if mechanism can explain the origin and the design of life, if it can explain the history and the diversity of life, then the argument goes that a creator is not needed. And I've met many people who are skeptics because of that very point. They argue that if we can explain biology through evolutionary processes, then a creator is superfluous. I know Christians who have walked away from their faith for this very reason. And so what I am doing by raising the point that the scientific community does not have valid, robust explanations for the origin of life, and that every approach to the origin of life has resulted in a dead end, by making that point, I'm challenging that worldview idea, that paradigm that says mechanism alone can explain the origin of life. And the hope is that in doing that, it helps people to recognize that there's aspects of the evolutionary framework, of the evolutionary paradigm, that really falls short, and therefore opens up the possibility that a creator may have played a role in the origin and the design of life, at least, at minimum. And couple that with the challenges to the origin of life from an evolutionary perspective is the very powerful evidence for design that we see in biology, that we can construct a number of different arguments for God's existence, including a revitalized watchmaker argument, a converse watchmaker argument, the empirical argument for God's existence, the bioinspiration argument for God's existence, the beauty argument for God's existence, the wisdom argument for God's existence. These are all independent arguments that we can make looking at the design of biochemical systems to make a positive case for a creator. But this positive case is most potent when it's coupled to a scientific critique of the capacity of evolution to generate the origin of life. So I'm not being disingenuous, but I'm being very precise, in fact, by saying that, again, the origin of life challenges, the scientific challenges to the origin of life, reflect a key piece of evidence that undermines this commitment to mechanism to explain the origin, design, and the history of life. Now, to further point out that I'm not being disingenuous when I make this statement, I've produced a number of resources here at Reasons to Believe where I discuss my approach to engaging the theory of evolution. And what I point out there is that when we talk about evolution, it really is an ambiguous term that can refer to a number of different types of presumed evolutionary transformations. When we use evolution, we can refer to variation happening within a species, adaptation, if you will, or microevolution. We can refer to speciation, where one species gives rise to a closely related sister species. We can be referring to macroevolution, where evolutionary mechanisms can generate large-scale biological change, including innovation in the biological arena. And then microbial evolution, which refers to evolution happening among single-celled organisms that are capable of both asexual and sexual reproduction. And then the last category I like to talk about is chemical evolution, which is, again, abiogenesis and the origin of life. So the point being this, that as I engage the evolutionary paradigm, I really bifurcate evolution. Actually, bifurcation isn't the correct word, because I break it into 5 different categories, with my point being we need to assess each scale of evolutionary transformation in its own terms, and that we can only say that microevolution, for example, is indeed a fact if we can validate it with evidence that supports that level of evolutionary transformation. And as we've written about and have produced videos about this engagement, we've pointed out that we think the evidence is there for microevolution, that we think the evidence is there for speciation, that the evidence is there for microbial evolution, but yet we're skeptical about the capacity of these very mechanisms that can drive microevolutionary changes in speciation being extrapolated to account for large-scale transitions that would have to happen in terms of macroevolution. That is, we challenge the idea that you can simply extrapolate these mechanisms of evolution over vast enough periods of time to account for large-scale biological change and innovation. We question the capacity of those mechanisms to do that. But part of our assessment of the evolutionary framework is also to point out that we do not have very good evidence. In fact, we have no evidence whatsoever that evolutionary mechanisms can account for the origin of life or the generation of the very first cells, starting with chemical materials. And so we actually do distinguish chemical evolution from the theory of evolution, or the theory of biological evolution, which would specifically include microevolution, speciation, macroevolution, and microbial evolution. Now, having said all of that, which I think, again, is really a handy, helpful way of thinking about evolution and engaging evolution as a Christian, I do want to point out that if one was being a little bit mean-spirited, one could actually point out that people that are advocates of the evolutionary paradigm actually do something that I have been accused of, and other ID proponents and creationists have been accused of, by conflating chemical evolution with biological evolution. Because so often I see evolutionary biologists playing the shell game of evolution as they try to make a case for the evolutionary paradigm. So often people will point to examples of microevolution or speciation as justification for the belief that macroevolution is valid. A case in point, human beings have evolved through microevolutionary changes the capacity to digest milk sugar after about 2 years of age. This is due to the persistence of the lactase enzyme. Typically after 2 years of age, this enzyme is no longer produced, and at that point, people become lactose intolerant. It's part of the process of weaning the infant away from the mother. But due to mutations in regulatory regions of the lactase enzyme gene, lactase production persists in some adults, and this allows human beings to digest milk sugar. And this, of course, is an advantage because it allows for domestication of animals and milk as a source of nutrition, foodstuff for human beings. This is an example of microevolution and the idea that human beings are evolving. We're evolving in a microevolutionary sense, and yet I see people use this category and type of evidence to argue that human beings therefore must have evolved from a shared evolutionary ancestor with the chimpanzees and bonobos. And so this is an example of essentially utilizing evidence for one scale of evolution and in turn arguing that this is justification for evolution taking place in a different scale and in a different category. So evolutionary biologists are doing the same thing in a sense that they accuse ID proponents and creationists of doing. Now, having said that, I really do believe that we really should think about chemical evolution in a distinct category from biological evolution, I will point out that if one wants to be a stickler, you could actually argue that abiogenesis, or chemical evolution, or the origin of life, is actually deeply intertwined with the theory of biological evolution, that you cannot really separate one from the other. And why would I say this? Because according to the evolutionary framework, according to the theory of evolution, the evolutionary tree of life is anchored in an organism that is referred to as Luca, the last universal common ancestor. The idea is that this was an organism, or maybe a community of organisms, that essentially sit at the very base of the evolutionary tree of life, and that this organism, or collection of organisms, coalesce over time to produce three different diverging branches in the evolutionary tree that refer to three separate domains of life: the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukarya domains. And then with each of those domains, you see those domains breaking up, or diverging into different kingdoms that are part of these different domains of life. But the point is that Luca is the base of the evolutionary tree of life. Interestingly enough, Luca is also the endpoint of chemical evolution, or abiogenesis, or the origin of life process. So in a sense, if you think of Luca as the base of the evolutionary tree of life, chemical evolution, or abiogenesis, is the root system for that evolutionary tree of life. In fact, one of the pieces of evidence that people will point to as evidence for universal common descent, and the idea that all life on Earth stems from this last universal common ancestor, is the universal nature of biochemical systems, with the argument is that biochemistry that was imprinted in Luca as a result of the origin of life process now is reflected in the fundamental basic biological design of all life on Earth. As the different lineages diverge, that biochemistry that was found in Luca persists until this very day. And so the argument is that universal nature of biochemistry reflects a universal common descent. But that biochemistry was the product of chemical evolution, or the origin of life. That is, what happens during chemical evolution, according to the evolutionary framework, is imprinted on the evolutionary tree of life. And in fact, most origin of life researchers really don't have a clear idea where chemical evolution ends and biological evolution begins, because they produce protobionts, protocells that have a capacity for self-replication and can experience any kind of structural changes, that is, mutational changes of sorts. Those organisms, or those pre-organisms or proto-organisms, are going to begin to evolve through a form of Darwinian evolution, a form of biological evolution. Chemical evolution shaped the very first cells on Earth, and in turn transforming those cells into the last universal common ancestor. I've heard origins of life researchers refer to chemical evolution as the beginnings of biological evolution, and this is part of the reason for that. So in other words, if you embrace the theory of evolution, you really are looking at a continuum from the very simplest molecules present on early Earth to organisms that populate the very tips of the branches of the evolutionary tree of life. That there is this continuum, and that any kind of division between chemical evolution and biological evolution is really an arbitrary division that you are introducing. And so you could argue that if somebody shows that chemical evolution lacks scientific explanations, that it lacks scientific validity, that really does, in a sense, cast aspersions on all of biological evolution, because of the role that Luca plays, and again, because of the universal nature of biochemistry. Now, I think that that when you are approaching the question of evolution, it is convenient and useful to distinguish chemical evolution from the four different types of biological evolution that we discussed. And again, I think responsible scholarship would be to evaluate each category of evolution in and of its on its own terms, where just because one particular category is valid or invalid doesn't mean that other categories are valid or invalid. I think that's the proper, responsible way to assess, again, the different aspects of evolution. And that's what I would advocate for. But I don't think people are being disingenuous to connect the chemical evolution to biological evolution for the very reasons that I just outlined. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close and point out that at the end of the day, to me, when a skeptic brings up this challenge that chemical evolution has nothing to do with biological evolution, what they really are doing, and I say this with due respect, is creating a diversionary tactic. They are trying to divert your attention away from the fact that there is no evidence for how mechanism can produce the very first cells. And by diverting attention away from that, they no longer have to address or deal with the fact that you have a really significant problem on your hand if you are embracing the evolutionary paradigm. Again, the idea that the origin and the design and the history and the diversity of life can be explained through mechanism alone. And so to me, I don't really care at the end of the day whether the theory of evolution is true or not. What I do care about is showing people that there is compelling scientific evidence from biology for a creator's existence and role in bringing life into being. And that evidence includes positive arguments for design when we look at the nature of biochemical systems, which are the fundamental systems of life. But part of that argument is also to point out that mechanism seems to come up short in accounting for the first life forms and the design that we see in biochemical systems. And as a result of that, makes it legitimate for people to think that indeed a creator exists, and eliminates this excuse that if mechanism can explain everything, I no longer have a need for a creator. Because I think you do have a need for a creator, and the origin of life highlights that need scientifically very clearly. So anyway, I'm going to bring things to a close. I'm going to remind you to just take a moment, check in, let us know who you are, where you're watching from, and give us reasons why you enjoy this broadcast or why you find the broadcast valuable, and also ways in which we can improve the broadcast. That's much appreciated as well. Don't forget to use the like button to like the broadcast, to react to the broadcast. This helps increase the visibility in the Facebook feed. I want to know what you think about this question. I'm very interested in your perspective. And then last but not least, don't forget to take advantage of this opportunity to get free stuff from Reasons to Believe. Just text FUZZ, F-U-Z, to 31996, or go to this URL, reasons.org/fuzz. Both will take you to a portal that will give you access to 2 copies from the book Origins of Life and a video download and other resources that you're going to find valuable as you explore the relationship between science and the Christian faith. And I'm going to close the program by saying God bless you and reminding you that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless you. See you next time.